Science, without a soul.
You know, there's an oath to do no harm. But what happens when that's forgotten? What happens when curiosity sours into cruelty? When the search for progress demands a price paid in human suffering? We're about to look at what happens when the very people we trust to heal us decide to harm us instead, all in the name of science.
So, our first stop on this dark journey, well, it starts with something you'd think is pretty innocent, candy, and a simple question about what it really does to our teeth.
Okay, so picture this. It's the 1930s, and Sweden has a massive dental problem. A staggering 83% of kids have cavities. The government is desperate for answers, and you know who else is? The candy industry. They really want to prove it's not their fault, so they funded a big study to find out for sure. All they needed were human test subjects.
And they found them, right here, at the Vipeholm institution. It was home to people who couldn't say no, who couldn't give consent, and whose pain they figured could be easily swept under the rug.
Let that sink in. That's a direct quote from the medical board. They saw these vulnerable people and called them perfect cannon fodder. Not patients, not even human beings, just raw material for an experiment designed to systematically rot their bodies from the inside out.
The method was just as cold as that quote. First, for 2 whole years, they set a baseline, gave the patients a healthy, low-sugar diet, and guess what? No new cavities. Then, the real experiment began. They weaponized sugar, literally force-feeding it to them day after day. The grand finale? A specially designed, super sticky toffee, a candy engineered with malice, just to cling to their teeth and cause as much decay as possible.
And the result was exactly as horrific as you'd imagine. Total devastation. Their teeth were destroyed, just riddled with deep, painful cavities. We're talking about constant, agonizing pain and damage that could never, ever be undone. Their teeth were rotten, right down to the root.
All right, so we've seen the physical torment. Now we're going to shift to the invisible wounds, the kind of damage inflicted not with sugar or a drill, but with words.
Back in 1939, a psychologist at the University of Iowa had a theory. And the question behind what would eventually be called the monster study is just bone-chillingly simple. Can you take a perfectly normal child and psychologically torture them until they develop a stutter?
And where did they run this so-called study? An orphanage. They took 22 kids and split them up. The ones who already had a stutter, they got praise, encouragement. But for 6 children, kids who spoke perfectly fine, the experiment was nothing short of psychological warfare. They were told over and over again that they were broken, that their speech was bad. A lie repeated until it became their terrifying reality. Imagine being a little kid and hearing this every single day. Don't ever speak unless you can do it right. They were constantly criticized, constantly told they were wrong and needed to be fixed. They were taught that it was better to be silent than to make a mistake.
Now, here's the twisted part. The study didn't actually make them stutter, but the damage it did was catastrophic. These were normal, happy kids who became anxious, quiet, and withdrawn. They became terrified to even open their mouths, sometimes only speaking in 1- or 2-word answers. They hid from people, started punishing themselves from speaking, and carried those scars for the rest of their lives.
So, we've gone from a ward of patients to a group of orphans. Now we're zooming out to an entire prison population, where the human body wasn't seen as a person, but as a canvas. A walking test site for whatever chemicals and drugs they could get their hands on.
For 23 years. I want you to just let that number sink in. For more than 2 decades, Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania was, for all intents and purposes, a human laboratory. It was funded by huge chemical companies, even the U.S. Army, and it basically had no oversight. It was just a factory of suffering running right out in the open.
This is what the head doctor on the project, a dermatologist named Albert Kligman, said when he walked into the prison. All I saw before me were acres of skin. Not people, not inmates, a field, ready to be plowed, planted with poisons, and harvested for data.
So what was the going rate for an acre of skin? A few bucks. That's what you got, have your body exposed to chemicals that would literally make your skin blister and fall off. $10 to have your back sliced open, packed with gauze, and then sewn shut. They tested carcinogens, psychoactive drugs, even dioxin, the main ingredient in Agent Orange. And they left behind a wake of scarred, broken bodies. The official story, of course, was that this was all voluntary, that the inmates were lining up to do it for the pocket money. But you have to ask yourself, and this is a question that haunts all of these stories, When a person is that desperate, when their choice is between misery and pain, can you really call it a choice? Is that consent?
And now, we arrive at the absolute bottom, the final circle of hell. A place where science isn't even the point anymore. It's just a paper-thin excuse for pure, sadistic pleasure. We're going to Auschwitz. We're talking about Josef Mengele. One of the doctors who survived the camp described Mengele's unique brand of evil. He'd walk into the children's barracks and be kind. He'd give them candy. He'd get them to like him, to trust him. And then, in the very next breath, with the smoke from the crematoria filling the air, he would be the one to send those exact same children to their deaths.
His absolute obsession was twins, and his method was just this grotesque parody of science. He'd isolate a pair of twins, he would perform some unspeakable experiment on one, injecting them with diseases, performing amputations, while keeping the other as the untouched control. And then when he was done, he'd kill them both, often with an injection straight to the heart, so he could dissect their bodies and compare them.
The list of what he did, it's almost impossible to comprehend. He did surgery with no anesthesia. He injected chemicals and diseases into children. He tried to create conjoined twins by literally sewing two children together. He injected dye into their eyeballs to try and change the color. And when that was done, he'd pull the eyes out and pin them to his office wall like a butterfly collection. This wasn't research. It was a catalog of cruelty.
In total, he experimented on about 1,500 pairs of twins. That's 3,000 children. Out of all of them, it's estimated that only about 200 people survived. You have to understand, these stories, they aren't just anomalies. They were conscious choices made by educated doctors and scientists who decided that data was more important than a human life. And it forces you to face this truly terrifying question. When you strip away all the rules, all the ethics, all the empathy, how thin is that line between scientific curiosity and pure human monstrosity? Because once that line is crossed, you end up in the darkest places imaginable.